Welcome to the Reconstruction segment at the Harvard Arab Weekend. My name is Ramzi Naja. I'm a student in my final year here at the Graduate School of Design. Together with a team of colleagues, we organized this segment to cover a series of concepts and precedents in Reconstruction that concludes with a conversation on visions for Syria. Cities across the Arab world have experienced different forms and grades of conflict, such as extreme cases like the Lebanese civil war, the Syrian crisis, and the Gulf Wars, and ranging to the happenings of the Arab Spring. Rapid construction and re-urbanization has struck many of the region's cities, whether in response to damages from war or as an economic propeller. Today, the region faces the most catastrophic urban destruction it's seen in centuries. I took a trip to Syria only weeks before the conflict erupted. With the fascination of that experience in mind, my focus shifted to questioning how destroyed cities can be revitalized, brought back, preserved. The talks of this afternoon will highlight the agency and the impact of architecture and planning on reconstruction, both physically and socially. We're honored to have 9 outstanding speakers here today, each of whom will introduce a unique perspective to the discussion, allowing for a direct conversation on critical issues of urbanism in the Arab world today. We will begin with introductory remarks by our 3 moderators for 10 minutes each, and then we'll go through a sequence of 3 talks on post-conflict reconstruction, resources and identity in Syria tomorrow. Each talk will be followed by a Q&A session. There's plenty to talk about and only limited time, so we'll take 2 short 5-minute breaks between the 3 talks. We'll have coffee by the entrance to the auditorium as well. After this, we're going to have a reception outside, and we invite you all to join us. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and I'll begin by introducing and welcoming our guests. Our first moderator, Anne-Marie Gamstrup, is an old friend who I had the pleasure of meeting in Beirut when she was relocating the Henning Larsen offices from Damascus. Anne-Marie is a practicing architect focusing on cultural and community projects. She founded Gamstrup Limited in 2015 after being a partner at Henning Larsen for more than 10 years, where she was a lead designer behind a number of museums and large-scale residential projects. She was also principal in charge of their branch offices in Damascus and then Beirut and later Istanbul. Anne-Marie also runs the charity Imagination, a platform for cross-cultural dialogue between architects and students.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. You guys have lined up a really interesting afternoon, so I hope you will all stay. I am here, if we maybe go to the next one. I'm here today in the role as, how do I flip these? I do it on this one, yeah. Whoops. I'm here in the role today as a moderator for the first session on post-conflict urbanism. I think the word post-conflict urbanism brings a lot of different associations or images to all of us. For me, urbanism is about something that matures, something that grows, something that changes over time, whereas post-conflict doesn't have to be maybe something negative. It is actually maybe a turning point, a sign of hope, and maybe there's a lot of energy also released that could be utilized. And you might say, I mean, how can we talk about this today when we have one of the biggest humanitarian crises going on in Syria right now? And I think we should talk about this because the way we plan our urban environment has very much to do with how we see our society, or how we want to see our society, or how we act in our society, what values we set up for our society. And I think culture and civil society has a very strong synergy with each other. Culture may be having to do with identity, which is going to be talked about in a later session today. In post-conflict areas, you're also going to have a lot of people, displaced people, moving home, who might have changed a bit of their culture or identity. You're going to have areas that might be self-governed for a while. So you need, or it might be a positive thing, to have a very strong civil society. And I don't think that there is any rules or master plans or an app you can download. How are we going to do this? I think hopefully today and onwards, There will be a lot of, I mean, you need to kind of look very much specifically about a particular setting. However, I would say that, in my opinion, there would be maybe 3 ingredients that would be very good to bring to the table. One being obviously a vision. And a vision, I think, is about values and about qualities. That strategic plans, for example, is about discussing qualities and maybe less about fixing quantities, which is what you do later in a master plan. I think you have to look at the user, what's the culture and context where you are, put your hands on the ground, where are you, what works here, and then participation, if maybe going from negotiation more towards collaboration and creating ownership so things grow from inside out. So what I'd like us to do in our panel today, we have 2 fantastic speakers from Beirut who's going to talk about Lebanon or Beirut in more specifics. And we will try to focus around 3 topics: lessons learned, approaches and tools, and then if we have time, talk a little bit about the intangible. And by the intangible, meaning the opposite of the tangible, the built fabric, but actually some of the maybe more soft values. And I think we also discussed yesterday and this morning that to keep it maybe more reflective, more from zoom out from the outside. So please stay, and I hope we will have an inspiring good afternoon together.
Thank you. Our second moderator today, Rania Hassan, began her work here at the Graduate School of Design, where she edited New Geographies 2, a pivotal issue of an influential journal. Rania is now assistant professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Planning and partner of Design Earth. Her work re-examines the urban condition at the scale of the territory to open up a range of aesthetic and political concerns for design research. Her current project focuses on technological systems such as those of energy, trash, and agriculture as objects of inquiry into our ideas and practices of the urban environment. Rania, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ramzi, and the organizer for putting this together. So the panel that I'll be moderating is called Resources and City Reinvention, and I'll start with a few comments and reflections to open up the concept of resources, but also to allow us to think about space at different scales, so the city, but also possibly the region and the territory as scales of concern. So forms of life, economy, and politics are mediated through our relationships with the forces and materials of the earth, or what we refer to as resources. In his book, Homo Geographicus, Robert Sack notes, "We human are geographical beings, transforming the earth and making it into a home, and that transformed world affects who we are." He adds that the consequences of our geographical agency are more pressing because we are now geographical leviathans. Such large-scale transformation of the earth into resources differentiates between a certain value, usually economic, attributed to the desired extracted goods, and to unproductive or byproduct environmental waste such as pollution, public health, the degradation of shared resources. Economists commonly employ the term externalities to refer to such unpaid costs. Unpaid in as far as a substantial portion of the actual cost of production remains unaccounted for in entrepreneurial outlays. Instead, they're shifted to and ultimately borne by third persons, by the community as a whole, or by some unforeseen territories. So how do we develop a political and aesthetic strategy of actualizing these resources and externalities? What scales, what viewpoints, and what values come to matter in the making of territories? And what imaginations can we claim in the production of these spaces to allow us to bring them back into public controversies, but also into disciplinary practices? Since we're in the Graduate School of Design, that's one of our practices. So let me start with a short anecdote that I like to use to speak about that relationship between resources and the city, and maybe point to the dissatisfaction that the city poses as a category of thinking in urbanism. You're looking at an image from a corporate advertising campaign by Total. So in 2008, the oil and gas company conducted this campaign to articulate its position on the future of energy vis-à-vis the rising specter of climate change. Their motto, Communauté d'intérêt, or common interests, proposed to reconcile the objectives of economic growth, i.e. more energy demands, with the environmental pressures to reduce carbon emissions. And that in the consensual image of the common as a space, but also the common as the community. Visually, the campaign built on this split-screen strategy with two perfectly mirrored halves. This frame, for example, has a polar prospection landform on one side that reflects into an all-iconic Manhattan skyline. It first divides city from nature into the distinct and essentialized domains to later reunite them in this image of rigid symmetry. So what are the politics of construction when we're thinking about regions of resources or the categories of cities and resources? I'd like to propose that these images, such as the Total corporate campaign, these representations of resource territories, operate as powerful tool to contain and hence depoliticize space when we're planning for resources. In the history of oil, for example, space is one of the venues through which the associated costs of production are shifted out of sight. For while extending across the earth to fuel cities and heat homes, fossil fuel urbanism has rested on the industry's capacity to appropriate and centralize flows, while divesting itself of the environmental transformations brought about by the global expansion of the extractive frontier, by sliding them to the periphery, to the offshore, and very appropriately in relation to this panel this afternoon, to the desert. One might argue that the mandate for our clean urbanism, what we're calling for, has rested on the city's capacity to divest itself and relegating that responsibility to what we collectively refer to as an externality field. So the moment urbanism focuses on the city as an object of concern, we lose the larger scale within which the city is located. So why does it matter whether resources are spatially imagined? Why does it matter that we as urbanists or we as citizens think of spaces beyond the city as objects of concern? One, if we're looking at the alternative images that are proposed in relation to the images that circulated during the age of oil up till now, one can see that the desert continues to operate as this background for the imagination, in which the alternative, be it the solar fields in this pattern, hosts the similar conventions of the representational regime. So what do I mean? One is that the complexity of the system that is put in place, the larger technological system that makes energy possible, is reduced to a set of either a thin line that crosses the landscape or a few panels. So on one hand, the technological system in its complexity is reduced. Secondly, the geography in which these systems are deployed are often reduced to a tabula rasa or to their minimum occupancy level. They're only populated with a few guest starring actors, be it camels or other traveling species. And that such abstraction depoliticizes the desert into a friction-free entity, which is unhindered by the dimensions of space, somehow beyond geography. It seeks to disconnect the regions of energy production, our image of the metropolis, from the sites of production. And while doing that, does not address the larger transformation that are part of the making of our energy regimes. So, in my work, I've touched on a couple of instances in relation to the subject of the panel in which the sites of resource extraction and the desert intersect in their narrative. One of which actually takes on the previous provocation of looking at North Africa as the productive hinterland of Europe, in this case specifically looking at the town of Hassi Massoud as the oil extraction town in Algeria's largest oil field, and actually tracing the multiple transformation that the state was involved to when they were deciding on priorities with respect to how do they ensure the national economy, which rests at more than 90% on oil and gas, the desire to secure the Sahara, which is a large security concern, especially in the years post-2000, and their desire to settle populations across large swaths of land. And in these cases, there were multiple plans for Hassi Mas'ud that we're part of, but the imagination of the desert was very pronounced in those. Another story that I've looked at is the story of the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which cuts across 4 countries in the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia through Jordan, Syria, and on to the Zahrani port, a refinery in southern Lebanon. And in that, looking at the transformation that are part of the making of both political boundaries but also social systems in much of the northern Saudi Arabia, but also some of the more arid regions that we'll talk more extensively about as the Badia today. So rather than a shortcut in steel, understanding the thickness of these systems. And for the sake of the panel this afternoon, we'll actually examine the space of resources, particularly in relation to this desert imaginary. It asks us to think about questions of where do we stand on the relationship between knowledge, economics, and the environment, and what's the agency of design in particular in shaping technological systems, but also spaces that are beyond the city. So to help us materialize these technologies of both resources and the spaces from the desert, we'll hear from Gunal on Masdar and from Saqqa on Al-Badia, both examples which think about questions of energy and urban development, but also the extent of the architectural imagination at scales beyond the city. And I would conclude by saying that at the time when these questions of economy, resources, and the environment are at the forefront of both design and political concern, it's quite important to avoid that categories such as green or clean urbanism purge once again dirty matters of geography or of spaces that lie outside of the city. For should the transition to a renewable regime not be part of a larger reflection on the spaces and the geographies upon which our current energy regime rests, and by looking into the proposed geographies of these alternative renewable zero carbon sectors, wind or solar, then these projects may usher in little, if any, political and economic transformation and merely pay lip service to an ecological discourse in urbanism. This is why the debate over the next mode of resources requires a geographic examination to foresee and possibly avoid the potential perpetuation of uneven geographies of power in the sun belts, fields, and wind corridors of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll end our introductions today with Lisa Wedeen, who is the Mary Morton Professor of Political Science and the co-director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago. She is also associate faculty in anthropology and the co-editor of the University of Chicago book series, Studies and Practices of Meaning. Her publications include Ambiguities of Domination, Politics, Rhetoric, and Symbols in Contemporary Syria, Ideology and Humor in Dark Times, Notes from Syria, Scientific Knowledge, Liberalism, and the Empire, American Political Science in the Modern Middle East. She's the recipient of the David Collier Mid-Career Achievement Award and an NSF Fellowship. She's currently working on a book about ideology, neoliberal autocracy, and generational change in Syria. Please.
I want to join my colleagues in thanking you, hosts, for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. And I'm the moderator for the third panel, an anthropologically oriented political theorist. 2 weeks ago, I was in New York helping to honor the anonymous Syrian film collective Abu Nadara, whose short, experimental, quasi-documentaries are posted online every Friday. I want to show you a brief clip. It's called Trajectory or Journey of an Unknown Soldier, Part 3. Can we have the clip?
في قراءات كثير بس هو إني حقهم بس كحق يعني إنه حق صنع نظرة تمام ما أعرف يمكن يعني الآراء موجودة بس ذبح ليش؟ ما أعرف ولا ليش ذبحت؟ ما أعرف شو صار إن ذبحت مثلا بسكين؟ ما أعرف شو مسكت سكين ذبحت قدامي؟ ما أعرف ذبحت وطلعت فيه ذبحته يعني ليش اللي ذبحه؟ ما أعرف شيء فاخ وانفصام يعني إنه كل شيء عام جسد اللي هذا روح العام جسد اللي ذبحه طلعت روح روح ساكت هيك أردنا ذكر في هذا الموضوع ما أذكر وقت ما كان حقي الناس اللي ما من حقي يذبح حد يذبح
This is a narrative of dissociation in which the soldier self-consciously recounts his killing of another by cutting the person's throat. The soldier's retrospective lamentation notes that while his body slaughtered the victim, his soul cried. Now he can scarcely imagine having done it. No level of resentment or revenge can make that legitimately right. We are seeing here what in United States troop parlance might be called moral injury. In other words, in which violence does not offer cathartic release, but damages the perpetrator, even one who can be seen to have been pursuing rightful revenge for wrongs done. The filmic strategy is to narrate the dissociation while at the same time diagnosing it as such, to suture the diegetic and the extra-diegetic in an effort to repair filmically what cannot be healed practically. Politically, the soldier begins by saying that he does not want to be like the other soldiers in the Free Syrian Army, but then he confesses that he has indeed acted like them. This acting of the body in violation of the soul suggests a specific horror of wartime, a dissociative experience in which killing is not, indeed cannot be, morally sanctioned. The video is clearly anti-regime, but it complicates that stance without diluting it. The film's powerful message is that a commitment, once it goes to war, is no longer the same. Commitments, like actual bodies, are mangled in the process. This short is the concluding part of a three-part series, which as a whole gives the viewer a sense of the unknown soldier's evolution. His anonymity, moreover, like the form of Abu Nadara as an anonymous collective, suggests a kind of national substitutability, in which each soldier is both replaceable and exemplary. Part 1 establishes that when the soldier first realized he could kill, he was scared, but he felt he had no choice. That refrain, that there was no choice, is a central animating theme of that first segment. He had to protect his family. He knows it's wrong to kill, but he had no choice. He fears God, but he had no choice. The regime left him with no choice. Part 2 describes his experience of entering a home where children had been lying dead for some days. There's no obvious cause of death. He and his fellow soldiers were looking for food and water and just happened into the dwelling. And in his search through the house, he hears, or bears witness rather, to a mother's love for the son she still cradles, both dead. He tells us that buildings to the back of the house, where he and others had been fighting, were besieged by the Assad regime's army, and he cries as he recalls the terrifying experience, part of a relentless nightmare in Syria's central city of Homs. It is a war that is both disorienting and suffocating. The family couldn't open a window. There was literally and figuratively no breathing allowed. These two segments lead up to part 3, which is the one we just saw. As with the work of other filmmakers, the point of this film is to depict how the experience of war has caused protagonists to cease to recognize themselves and to lose their capacity for political orientation. The promising possibilities of a common world put forward in the early days of the uprising have been crushed, not only by the ability of the regime to hang on to power, but by the violence itself. And the soldier, like the director, seems to be involved in a project of repair, an acknowledgement of war's horrors without recourse to sentimentality. Indeed, the Abu Nadara Collective has been keen to oppose the seductiveness of suffering's optics, preferring in this clip to tell the story of a perpetrator who is himself a victim of war's dehumanization. But the broken soldier may also be reclaiming the human capacity for politics by repudiating violence and turning to speech. In a situation reminiscent of Isaac Denison's memorable observation, reiterated by Hannah Arendt, quote, "All sorrows can be borne if you can put them into a story or tell a story about them," unquote. And this trilogy seems to be the soldier's attempt to restore himself to the wholeness he has lost, to put back together a self that has been sundered by war. And as in most bloody wars, it is the broken lives of ordinary survivors that will have to be pieced back together one day. And as in most tragedies, along with the devastating heartache and loss, come moving examples of grace and dignity. We should not allow today's shocking brutality to blind us to those initial heady days of revolt, to the youthful hopes that powered them, as well as the important refutations of tyranny and the revelatory pleasures of self-discovery that produced a world-affirming, albeit short-lived, sense of the political. Any emancipatory politics of the future will have the possibilities inherent in those initial moments to draw on when people attempted to inaugurate an affirmative politics that relied on but also had the capacity to outlive any single individual's display of courage. Now, it's difficult not to despair or to question how any projects of reconstruction, the third panel, could gain much salutary traction in such troubled times. All of the available political choices seem awful, with the direct and estimable pleasures that revolutionaries and regime supporters alike enjoyed 4 years ago, irretrievably lost. We shall hear today from an economist whose social market reforms have sometimes been called being part of the problem, a source of anguish for those in zones of abandonment, where privatization meant the attenuation of state services, blocked aspirations for upward mobility, and unmet desires for the good life. For others, though, it meant experiencing hitherto unprecedented social freedoms and the new pleasures of prosperity and sociability made available through markets. We shall see what Dr. Dardari's visions for Reconstruction look like, how they will attempt to forefend against what he calls, somewhat euphemistically, governance challenges. I take this to mean not only grappling with areas of the country that are now run by the equivalent of warlords and the regime's shabiha, but also figuring out ways to forefend against the rapaciousness of the regime's brand of crony capitalism or kleptocratic rule. We shall also hear from a creative artist, architect, curator, Khalid Mullas, and will invite him to elaborate on the ways in which architecture and art might help us see beyond current impasses, alerting us not simply to the fact of displacement, but to its implications for the future. To what extent do these visions have to operate within a national space and temporality, for example? Excavating the Sky, his work for the Biennale this year, operated within a nationalist episteme, but its title and substance also suggest creative inversions, the generative mixing of metaphors, a way of unsettling or ungrounding the familiar. He gives us an aspirational consciousness not tethered to commerce. Other questions that come to the fore here: what kinds of political programs are enabling of built environments and vice versa? How will each of our speakers think about the questions of justice and well-being? And how might opportunities for mutuality, reciprocity, and world building move beyond transitional justice models in which perpetrators of various sorts become post-war beneficiaries? As the political theorist Robert Meister has asked, how can we rethink the moral and practical relations between the beneficiaries of social and political injustice and its victims, so that reconstruction becomes more than a way for the professional managerial elite to profit anew off of death and destruction? For my part, politically engaged scholarly work operates in registers of both reparative desire and despondency simultaneously, producing at its best a prohibited knowledge people already know and can gradually, with others, confront. Thank you.